Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is episode 99 in the series. Phew, we're getting close to 100, and that seems like some kind of mile marker. We're gonna have to do something at episode 100. I don't know what it's gonna be, but it should be fun and good. Yeah. I hope you guys are all well. It's a beautiful Sunday morning here in Urbana, Illinois, where I'm coming to you from. A lot of you guys know I'm a professor at the university there, and in all of my copious spare time, I knit a lot of garments. That's pretty much all you need to know about me and this podcast if you're new. And if you're new, welcome. And if you're coming back, it's lovely to see you and hear from you guys in the comments and all the emails. I've gotten some lovely email questions lately about different kinds of knitting, and I love getting those questions. So please keep them coming. You can always get me at knittingthestash@gmail.com. What else should I tell you? I usually tell you where you can find me. You can also find me as Knitting the Stash just about everywhere. So YouTube, Ravelry, Instagram. Oh, that's where I'm at as Knitting the Stash. And I'm sporting my local vegetarian restaurant, the Red Herring. This is some of their merch. I actually won it in a raffle contest the last week because they've been doing food deliveries and I've been, supporting local food businesses. So I get some vegetarian food, they deliver it to the house, and my order just happened to be the winner of the raffle for this past week. So I felt like I had to sport my Red Herring vegetarian love for today. So what am I going to talk to you about today in terms of knitting? Well, I have the flight sweater. Oh, my sweater from size 2 needles is done. Yay. This is Flight by Sarah Pope, Brooklyn Tweed. We'll talk about that. We'll also talk about the Bohus. Emphasis is on the second syllable. Am I correct about that? Those of you who are Swedish speakers, Bohus tradition? Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. So I've got Poems of Color to talk about, which is a book by Wendy Keel. And I got a question from you guys about superwash liners in garments. So like in the brim of a hat or in the collar of a sweater. So I'll talk about that just a little bit toward the end. And I have the giveaway winners for the Parks and Rec Pullover draw. Yay! So shall we jump right in with the flight sweater from Sarah Pope? I think so. Now, a lot of you guys who have been tuning in for a while know that this one took me a while, and I'm usually a pretty quick sweater knitter. If it's DK or worsted, couple of weeks, done with a sweater. When it's fingering weight, it can take like 3 weeks, sometimes 4 if it's really taken me a while. And this one was a surprise to me because I've knit with Brooklyn Tweed Loft before. I actually knit the Wool and Honey sweater for Wool and Honey, the yarn shop up in Michigan. This was the Andrea Mowry pattern. I knit the Wool and Honey out of Loft for them, maybe 2 years ago? So I've worked with the yarn before, and I knew that it was a little bit fragile, a little finicky, and I also knew that I could get a sweater done in it pretty quickly. I think I did the sweater for them in just a couple of weeks. But that sweater was cropped, and yeah, so a cropped sweater is a much smaller sweater, even though it was in a larger size than I usually make. Anyway, this one took me a while. You guys know this now. And one of the reasons it took a while is that for this pattern, I think they call for using a size 4 needle. I had to go down to a size 2, US 2, to be able to get gauge. And for those of you who don't use US sizes, a US 2 is a 2.75 millimeter needle. So pretty small. And for the lining, you can see that it's a turned hem here and on the cuffs. I used a size 1 for that, so that was even smaller. And I was using my ChowGoo interchangeables for that. If you don't know about the ChowGoo interchangeables, they're usually used for sock knitting, but I use them for any small gauge stuff because it's like 00 to 1.5 or 2s maybe. I think maybe it doesn't quite go to 2, 1.5. Really flexible cords, wonderful interchangeable needle set, love it. Used it for the inside of these cuffs and the hem. So that was a size 1. The rest of the sweater's in size 2. I did go up to a size 3 for the color work because that's usually what I do with color work. Just go up at least 1 needle size so that it doesn't pucker and get all funny. So yeah, knitting a full-size sweater, that's actually a fairly long sweater, in size 2 needles takes quite a while. Yeah. And this yarn is a woolen yarn, and I think I've showed you guys, this was the swatch I did with size 4 needles. This is the swatch I did with size 2 needles, so I'll hold it up here so you might be able to get a better sense of what the fabric looks like, maybe. It's a really dark, it's a beautiful kind of chocolatey brown fabric, but it's hard to see. And when you wash it, it folds. It's an amazing fabric, an amazing yarn and amazing fabric, because it really does create this really fold fabric where there's very little, like I'm pushing on it with my thumb right now. You cannot see any light or air gaps there at all. So it doesn't felt, but it almost feels like it felted once it's washed. And I say that in part because I did all my gauge swatches. I know they're small gauge swatches. That usually does me just fine. And I went down, like I said, 2 needle sizes from the pattern, got gauge, and knit the 36 3/4 size. I think that's what it is in the pattern. And then once I washed it and blocked it, it turned into a size 40-inch bust. So this is just something for me to note for using loft, and something for maybe if you're using loft, you might note for later. The fabric you probably want to make a bigger swatch than you might think you need, just to make sure that you know what the fabric is going to actually do. Not all yarns are like that, but this one definitely was. So I'm actually kind of happy with it. I tend to make sweaters that are more 36, 37 bust. I'm at 34. So I like a little bit of ease, but not too much ease. This is actually incredibly comfortable and fits well, and it makes me kind of question in my mind and think a little bit more about different ease in different sweaters, and how sometimes you really do want more ease. And I tend to just, maybe like a lot of us, tend to make the same kind of choices about ease over and over again, when really it can surprise you that a sweater with less ease, that's more fitted, can be a really cool sweater. And a sweater that has more ease and is just a little bit more roomy can also be really comfortable, even if it's not your go-to kind of size. So it's something to keep in mind. And I'll put some pictures in here of me wearing this sweater, and you'll see that it looks just great. It looks really comfortable, and it looks like it fits well, even if it is, I think, so that would mean it's got 6 inches of ease. So, you know, that gives you, for those of you who are kind of like me and kind of stuck in your ways of, I only put in 2 or 3 inches of ease, you know, this is maybe a good kind of moment to be like, oh, something different can be cool. And then the other thing that made this a little bit different in terms of the ease in the sweater is that I decided early on, I modified, because that's what I do. I decided early on that I wanted the measurement down at the hips to be the same as at the bust. So this sweater in the pattern has all kinds of shaping, and it's shaping through the front and through the back, I believe. So it's kind of like darts. It's not shaping just on the side. It's kind of some really pretty shaping that would come up in here and then along the back in the same places. I decided I didn't want to do any of that, in part because when I'm working more directly from a pattern than modifying, you have to really be careful of like where your measurements are, and sometimes it can be off. Like if the shaping will pull the waist in at a certain point and you've mismeasured that on your own body, you know, that point where the smallest point could end up too high or too low, and then it's just a little bit uncomfortable. I tend to not put a lot of shaping into sweaters anyway, because I kind of have a pretty straight body. So I just thought I'd go with the straight body. I do think that this sweater, since it has so much extra ease in it, given the way that the fabric worked out, it would have been cool if I knew ahead of time that it was going to produce a size 40, I would have put in the shaping, because it would have been so subtle that it would have just been perfect. But live and learn. This is what this podcast is all about, right? So I didn't do the shaping modification, and I do think that this could be a little bit more of a delicately fitted sweater if you wanted to take the time to really make sure the measurements were good and you wanted to do the shaping and you knew exactly what your gauge was going to be in a big old swatch of this Brooklyn tweed loft. Put that all together in a little package and set it over here. So the bottom is the same size as the top, and the way I did that is to look through the pattern. I'm putting together a modifications class slowly but surely, and I'll talk about some of these things in the modification class. But if you look through the pattern, you can discern, this is a bottom-up sweater, you can discern what the stitch count is right around the bust before you split for the armholes, and then I use that stitch count to cast on with a slight variation, because I knew I was going to need to do some to increase out of the turned hem. little complicated there, but the basic notion is that you would take the number of stitches that you have up here around the bust, not counting the arms, the sleeves, and use that for your cast on, roughly speaking. But the idea is that you can read ahead in a pattern, and you can use the numbers and the measurements and the schematics and all that stuff in a pattern to make your modifications for different places in the pattern or in the sweater. So a couple of other things about this guy. It is like I said, it's a bottom-up sweater, and as you guys know from the last episode, the endless stockinette was a little bit maddening, just a little bit crazy. It took me, I think, a couple of weeks just to do the body and the sleeves up to the point of where the color work would actually be. And I don't know, sometimes I really love having these sweaters, and I talked about this in the last episode, like having a background sweater or a background project that's all stockinette is wonderful because you can just pick it up at meetings or whatever and just take it with you. But having this be kind of my main project was a little bit crazy making. That's okay. I probably don't want to knit a full-on stockinette sweater again anytime soon. But I will say that I do love the effect of this sweater, especially when it's on your body, because this all kind of goes away. It feels very much like a cloak of invisibility or something, and it just draws attention to the upper part of this sweater, which is this gorgeous color work. And I should mention that this is a sweater that is part of the Out of My League make-along that we're doing this year. So this is my second Out of My League project, and I acquired this pattern and the yarn for this way back in like I want to say it was 2014, so a good 6-7 years ago now. And one of the reasons that held me up was just the yarn itself. Working with it was very difficult in the beginning when I was a new knitter, because as you guys will see here, I'll pull some out so you can see, this is, as I said, a woolen yarn, and if I can pull some up here for you to see. It's a woolen yarn, and a lot of yarns you can tug on and really kind of like, give it a little snug up. This yarn you cannot, so if you do a little tug, it just comes apart. Partially because it's a woolen spun, and it's a very airy, lightly spun yarn. So that was intimidating to me in the beginning, and the fact that it had 3-color color work up at the top. So yeah, and what I didn't realize, I didn't even realize this until I got into the pattern. This pattern also has 3-color color work with purl stitches, and you can see the purl stitches are largely in the lighter colors, right? And they create this kind of beautiful blending of the colors going up toward this lightest color at the top. So you're not only managing 3 yarns, 3 colors on certain rows of the sweater, but you're also purling at certain moments. So that is an added complication that I'm very happy to have done now, and I've learned, but yeah. So I was curious about it because it was mentioned in some of the forums and some of the comments, like that this was very reminiscent of a kind of Bohus sweater style. And I happened to look in my library, and I have this book called Poems of Color by Wendy Keel, and this came out a while back. This is from 1995. But it's a great compilation of and history of the Bohus tradition. I'm going to keep getting it wrong. I'm going to keep working on it. So the Bohus tradition is a Swedish tradition, and it was a cottage industry started during the 1930s, I believe. And I was doing some reading in the history here. Basically, the Depression in the 1930s was particularly, I'm going to read to you just a little bit. The Depression was particularly devastating for the families of stone cutters in the rural areas of the province where paving stones were cut for use in streets and sidewalks in Sweden and abroad. The development of asphalt as a new surfacing material and exportation problems to a politically troubled Germany lowered the demand for stone and led to high unemployment among some stone cutters. And it was actually the stone cutters' wives who kind of came to seek some help from Emma Jacobson, who was the wife of the governor at the time, and here she is, and with all of her yarn. And so she helped create this kind of cottage industry of Bohus, what became Bohus sweater knitting. So there were women that were commissioned to knit these sweaters, and they were sold, and she held classes to bring people in and teach them how they would knit these sweaters. And I think it really became a kind of, beyond a kind of cottage industry, it actually became a kind of symbol of status to own one of these sweaters. So, for example, later in this introduction, Wendy writes, because the knitwear was expensive and considered a status symbol, Bohus stricning, which is Bohus knitting, was chided as being not for the everyday citizen with a thin wallet. But as noted by a critic in 1944, first it has to be mentioned that the result is perfection. The material, the colors, patterns, and shapes are in all aspects complete, so outstanding and charming that any type of criticism is meaningless. But you've got this kind of cottage industry that grows up because of a depression, and then it turns into a kind of status symbol to have one of these sweaters. So it's an interesting tradition, and one of the things about this book that's so cool is that Emma Jacobson didn't want to release a lot of information about her patterns and the Bohus knitting tradition and the entire like school of thought of how it came about. But she did want it eventually to, she wanted to have, recognition for what she had done. So as far as I understand, Wendy Keel was able to get access from Emma's children to write this book and kind of chronicle her work with and creation of this tradition. So this book is really invaluable for that reason, because it goes through so many of the images and so much of the history of how these designs evolved. And it talks a lot about I think there were 5 other designers who were working with Emma eventually to create the patterns. So it talks about them, and these are some of the women who were doing the knitting of the actual sweaters, which I think is really neat to see. These were the knitters who were recruited throughout Sweden to come and be part of the school and learn the tradition. And these knitters were paid actually fairly well for their sweaters, it seems like, for their piecework at the time. I'll give you a little snapshot here. So in 1941, when sweaters were first produced, a knitter earned 10 krona, or $2 for a cardigan, 1.9 krona or 36 cents for a pair of gloves, and 1.3 krona or 25 cents for a hat. Now that doesn't sound so great, but we're back in the 1940s. And by 1968, knitters earned 5 times as much or more for similar garments. And while the cost of coffee, apples, and milk doubled or tripled from 1941 to 1968, knitters' pay quintupled. The knitter's pay and benefits were always the highest component in the computation of the garment's cost. So I think that's really cool, especially for those of us who are interested in making sure that we're paying people in our community for the work that they do, designers and farmers and yarn producers and dyers. I think it's great to have a tradition like this that has that kind of history or background where the knitters who are actually doing the work were being paid for their labor in ways that were recognized and were kept up, not only kept up with inflation, but actually they were pretty well compensated. Now, on the other hand, here we have this question of whether or not the knitters actually enjoyed what they were doing. And I've read in different history books, historical accounts, and I've heard from different people, some of you, even you viewers who have written to me and said, oh, my grandmother was involved in this and she hated it, that, sometimes knitting for money can not be the best thing, like that a lot of women who are knitting for money eventually just didn't knit for pleasure anymore, right? And that gets captured in this book as well. I'll read you one other passage. Of course, not all of the knitters found the work enjoyable. One knitter described it as the work of the devil and did it only for the income it provided. Another prolific but weary knitter complained that if she had kept all the things she had knit for Bohus stricning, she wouldn't have been able to walk into her house. So that's a pretty interesting take on the whole thing. So I think it's interesting to take all of those economic and political and historical things into account. And I want to get back to this sweater here in just a minute. And I found a couple in here that actually are very reminiscent, or this sweater is very reminiscent of these sweaters that have the kind of like the fade to light going on there at the top. And even more interesting, especially for maybe those of you who have knit for production purposes or who are maybe unfamiliar with this tradition, there were these pattern cards that would go to the knitters, which I think is absolutely fascinating. And the pattern cards would, you wouldn't get a full pattern for the sweater. You would have knit the sweater for a certain size, for a certain bust size. They'd say, 40, 44, whatever it was, in a certain yarn, and it was a very specific yarn that was used. But you'd need to know a lot about how to handle your increases and decreases and your colors, because sometimes the designers would include up to 5 different colors in a row for these sweaters, apparently. So to do 3 in a row is really not so bad. But you might have 5 colors in a row in a single row that you're trying to carry across. And there wasn't a lot of discussion apparently about catching floats and whatnot, because the yarn that was being used was so sticky, and the idea that it would just kind of felt in the background. But you had to know how to handle 5 yarns going across with the purl stitches included. And you can see here, these little dashes are the purl stitches, in different representations. You'll see that. Now these sweaters could be knit in the flat, in the round, bottom up, top down, all different ways. But these pattern cards were kind of very, they were coded, and you had to know how to read the code to be able to actually access what was going on in the pattern. So all of that considered, I would highly recommend that book, Poems of Color. Really interesting to learn about the Bohus tradition and to think about knitting as this kind of cottage industry that women were involved in that gained a certain kind of status eventually. So back to this sweater. As I said, it has that kind of purl stitch in there, and one of the reasons for that is that it looks like it lifts up the color from the lower row, so you get a better kind of blending and melding of the colors. It's a little bit of a smoother transition. It's not so blocky between the colors and the color work. I think originally in Wendy Keel's book, she talks about the fact that a lot of knitters, even Elizabeth Zimmerman, who was using a different scholar's kind of work to try to figure out what was going on, they had originally assumed there were slip stitches involved here, because that would be one of the ways to make one yarn more prominent than another, or to kind of move between colors more easily. But it really is these interesting purl stitches that can change the fabric. Now there's a great Knitty article out by Chrissy Gardner. This came out in 2008, and it's called Texturize Your Color Work. And she goes through a couple different swatches of color work that's just knit in stockinette plain, color work in which you knit only the contrast color in purl, and a swatch where you'd work the background color in purls. And the difference between those 3 swatches is amazing. And to respect her work, I'm not going to put it up on the screen here, but I would absolutely reference this Knitty article by Chrissy Gardner, and I hope you would go check it out. And she talks also about the Bohus tradition there, and some of the reasons for those purl stitches and how they actually function to create this kind of smoother transition with the fabric as you're working your color work. So I found all of that to be a really fun, kind of fascinating thing about this sweater that kind of redeemed the sweater for me in a way, because it was so many yards and yards of stockinette. And I do love the neckline, but I was happy to learn of this kind of history that it's referencing, and that redeemed the sweater for me in a lot of different ways. And I also think putting the sweater on after all of this really redeemed it as well, because it is a gorgeous framing of the face. No matter which colors you chose to do for this kind of yoke, it really does bring the tension just right up to your face. And I think it's cool that she called it flight. I'm guessing it has to do with the little V's and the kind of like the idea of geese flying right north or south. There's some really nice short rows that happen in this pattern, both before the color work here and after the color work here. And I've talked a lot about short rows on this podcast. And you can see that there's extra fabric right here that's not present on the front. You can see this is a much slimmer line here. And there's some nice, like I said, short rows hidden right underneath the yoke here to kind of raise the whole top. The other thing about this pattern that I'm not super crazy about, and I would probably change, but this is something I change about a lot of yoked sweaters with the colorwork yokes, is that you have to hide your decreases somewhere. And in this case, you're hiding your decreases in 3 or 4 different rows. And what that can do is it can create a little bit of this kind of, you can't really see it too well because of the fabric color. There's a tiny little bit of puckering that happens right below this colorwork where a lot of the decreases initially happen. And I'm not super crazy about that. I would like to find alternatives, and I've seen a few patterns that have alternatives. And you can see that the decreases then happen in the solid portion of the gray, the solid portion of the brown, And so they're hidden in there in a really nice way, but that first row of decreases just left me with a little bit of pucker around there, which is not just, you know, to my aesthetic eye. I'm like, ooh, but it's fine. It looks fine. And when you wear it, it really does sit absolutely fine. And I feel like I should show you the armpits, even though you might not be able to see them, because this is one of those really nice armpit constructions where you put your live stitches on waste yarn, and same for your sleeves, because you've knit your sleeves separately and your body separately, and you put a little bit of a few stitches on waste yarn on either side, and then you kitchen them together, and it makes like the most delightful armpit. So I just want to like shout out to Sarah Pope on this one, because that is a beautiful armpit. So one other thing I'd say is that for the contrast colors, you really don't need full skeins. It's one of those things where you end up with, you know, tons and tons of yarn left over, almost full skeins of yarn left over in the end. And so either finding a way to buy a yarn where you could use a smaller yardage, like mini skeins for the top, would be awesome. Or, you know, just having the expectation that you're going to make a hat or 3 out of your leftover yarn is probably a really good idea. I've been keeping all of my sweaters in these are bags by Awesome Granny bags, and I love them very much. These are the huge ones. She has extra large bags, and this one is a tote bag, so it's perfect. I can throw it over my shoulder. It has a zipper on the top and an inner pocket, which I love. So here's her, it's got yarn all over it. There's her tag, Bags by Awesome Granny. Check her out. She has a lot of great bags up on Etsy, and she does sales quite often. So I like her bags a lot. And they're big enough for sweaters, which is the best. So this is Flight by Sarah Pope, and it's the kind of sweater that I thought would never happen, but it did. Not only is it not going to happen because of the techniques involved, but then the hours of stockinette. So it's been a doubly interesting project, but I was so glad that it led me to the Bohus tradition and to get to read a little bit more about those women who are creating these sweaters and just crafting this kind of amazing legacy from the 30s onward. So for what it's worth, it was worth that, and it's a beautiful sweater and it fits, and a little bumps along the way, but you know, in the end, it's produced something cool. So after the last couple of episodes where I've talked about putting liners in collars with superwash yarns, I had a few questions about how that would work out, especially with superwash yarns, because the fear, I think, is that superwash yarns are going to stretch out and kind of mess up your sweater. And yes, superwash yarns are absolutely going to stretch and drape in very different ways than woolly yarns. And I've knit 1 or 2 sweaters only in a superwash yarn, and there's a reason for that, because they really do stretch out. You need a particular pattern if you're going to use a superwash yarn. You want to know its properties, and you want to take advantage of those properties for the sweater. And if you can do that, you're going to have a beautiful sweater, and there's no reason not to use a superwash yarn. But if you're going to use a superwash yarn combined with a woolly yarn, that's where the question comes in. Like, will the superwash yarn act all funny with the woolly yarn? And I just wanted to show you a few examples of how that is not the case. So this is a hat I've knit. This is a Black Crow Knits hat, which I absolutely love, and I've knit a few different versions of. And it calls for a turned hem, and I've always, whenever I do a turned hem in a hat, I've always used a superwash yarn on the inside so that it's really cozy and comfy and soft and squishy. And this is one in which I did that, and it was one where you actually cast on with your inner yarn. So for her, I think she uses just, you know, the same yarn on both sides. So I was casting on with the superwash yarn, provisional cast on, so that you could do this turned hem where you catch it, where you knit the two together. And all I did was to make sure that I had a yarn that was about the same weight and about the same grist, so the same number of yards for weight. And I did, I believe I did a 1-for-1 on this. Just used the same stitch count and turned did the picot edge here and continued in the regular yarn. So if I were to count this up, I think it's 1-for-1. I'm almost positive it's 1-for-1. And I'll just say, like, this hat it's one of my favorite hats because it's comfy. It's not, I don't like a tight hat, and it just fits my head really well. It's never really stretched out or done anything weird. It just is, and you can see it sits just fine within the hat. So there's one example. The others would be my alias sweaters. This is an Isabel Kramer pattern, and you know I love my alias sweaters. So this was the first one I knit out of a local Shetland yarn that I dyed myself, and I wanted to have, the pattern does not call for this, but I wanted to have a turned collar that had an inner different color superwash yarn to kind of give it a little flair. So in this case, you knit in the opposite direction. You're knitting your collar this way, you put in your turn row, and then you continue on with your superwash yarn. And I chose this superwash yarn. It's got a nice contrast. And again, you can see that I followed the pattern. So the outside, you can't see the patterning very well. The inside, you can see it has this patterning going on, this rib. And I followed it exactly as I would have. So there's no, I didn't decrease any stitches or anything like that. I even did the faux cable on the inside here in the same number of stitches. And it has held up incredibly well. It just sits very nicely, perfectly. It didn't stretch out or do anything funny. And I think that's in part because, like the hat, you not only have this row where you're joining them, so that kind of holds everything in place. You have your turned row, and it just, I don't know, it just seems to hold everything just fine in place. And I did the same thing with my second alias. This is out of Isle Yarn DK weight, so it's a very woolly, long wool yarn, not even a Shetland. And on the inside I did the same thing. I put a superwash yarn on the inside. I did the same thing with the following the pattern, and I even added a little pink in there just for the fun of it. And it too has been absolutely great, perfect stand-up collar, but it's not like sagged out or gotten too drapey or anything like that. And again, I think if you're doing this in small sections, like a collar or the brim of a hat, if you have the structural elements in there, you think about, you're picking up your stitches here, you have your turn row, you're tacking your stitches down on the inside, whether with a whip stitch or by knitting two together, whatever it is, you're creating a kind of structure for that superwash yarn, so it doesn't really have that much space it doesn't have anywhere to go. It can't really rebel and do its own thing. So for me, in each of these cases, I haven't had any problem, and I didn't have to go down a needle size or use a different number of stitches or anything like that. Now, if you're doing something where you're adding a liner to something and you're using, you were using a DK weight yarn on like a mitten, on the outside of a mitten, and then on the inside you're going to use a fingering weight yarn, then yes, you need to either adjust your stitch count, adjust your needle size, maybe even both, to make that liner fit inside the mitten. If the outside is wool and the inside is superwash, you're not going to have too much trouble with the inside kind of getting all blah and like too drapey or mushy or whatever. But you will want to go down a little bit, either by stitch count or needle size, to make that fit inside. With a collar, you're not really fitting anything inside. It's just a really short piece of fabric. And for me, this has been perfect, and so I'd encourage you guys to try it and see what you think. I'd love to know your feedback on that technique, and if you come up with any more specific ideas about when to do certain things or when not to do other things, I think that would be really helpful for everyone to hear about those experiments, so please share. All right, last but not least, I have the giveaway winners for the Parks and Rec Pullover, and this is my new sweater pattern that's just come out this past month. And thank you so much for its warm reception. You guys, so many of you bought the pattern and sent me little messages saying that you liked it and that you appreciated that it was out. So thank you so much for all the sweater love. I appreciate that. And the winners, I've picked two winners who will receive a free pattern, and that's Maria Crespo over on YouTube, and I've sent you a little notice. Maria, let me know if you'd like to receive it as a PDF on Ravelry or off Ravelry, either way. And the other winner is Linda, who is LS James over on the Ravelry thread. So congratulations to Linda and Maria. I hope you enjoy your Parks and Rec Pullover patterns. And I will have another giveaway on the next episode. It is episode 100, so we need to do something a little like spectacular. We can't do fireworks and whatnot, but we can do a giveaway that will be worthy of episode 100, so I hope you'll tune in then. And I guess that's it for today. I feel like we went all over the place. We went from Sarah Pope's flight to Bohus knitting tradition to Superwash liners. It was kind of a fun little exploration of things, as always, on the cast. So I wish you guys many hours of happy knitting, and I hope you're safe and healthy, and you can get vaccines if you want them soon. And yeah, I'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Thanks for hanging out. Bye-bye.